Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm going to be your host tonight. My name is Danielle. I'm on the outreach and marketing team here at Collegewise. I am originally from Los Angeles, California, and I went to school at Miami University in Ohio. And now I'm located in Charlotte, North Carolina. So that's where I'm coming from today. Before I hand it off to our wonderful presenter for the evening, I'm going to kick us off with some intro situation for people who might not have joined us before. Welcome. We are Collegewise. And before I actually get into that, I'm going to launch a little poll for the audience because we love to know who's here today. So if you guys could answer us, let us know who you are joining us. And if you want a little extra, you can drop in the chat where you're joining us from around the US. We love to know that as well. But on the poll, we just want to know, if you're a student, a parent, both, what grade you're in, and what brought you to our webinar tonight. So I'll leave that up and running and tell you a little bit more about us. Some of the services that we offer and how we help our students is through one-on-one counseling, test prep, and tutoring, which you'll hear a little bit more about tonight. But to really dive into more of our general background, we have been around for over 25 years now, which means we're not only the longest standing counseling firm, but we're also the largest in the US. We've worked with over 30,000 students, and 9 out of 10 of our students are accepted to one of their top 3 schools, which definitely just goes to show the expertise of our amazing counselors. We have a team of around 80 different counselors who are scattered all over the US and work really hard to support students like you and families like yours at home. So that's a little bit about us. And just before we dive in, a little bit of housekeeping on how we're going to run the show tonight. If you have questions throughout, we will have Q&A at the end, but please try and drop them into the Q&A feature on the bottom. We tend to use that one more than the chat, and we will not be using the raise your hand feature. So just ignore that guy and drop your questions into the Q&A down at the bottom. The other thing to remember is we will be receiving the recording tomorrow in your inbox. So if you miss anything or forget to take notes or want to go back to review something, you'll be able to watch the recording over and over again to your heart's content. So don't worry about it. You will have it in your inbox tomorrow afternoon. So I think that's all. Without further ado, I'll hand things off to Michael.
Danielle, thanks so much for the kind introduction, and everybody, it's nice to be here with you tonight. My name is Michael Goldstein, and I'm the Director of Instruction for Collegewise's tutoring team. I've been teaching and taking standardized tests full-time, going way back to 2009, and with apologies for what probably looks like a double headshot, on the left is my actual headshot, and then on the right is a picture of me standing outside of Travis High School here in Austin, where I actually took the digital SAT on Saturday, March 9th, alongside a group of endeavoring high school juniors. We're going to talk about that experience tonight and the experience that the students had as well as part of our exploration of the digital SAT. To that end, our agenda is fairly packed, so feel free to take notes at home if desirable, but do know again, as Danielle mentioned, that the recording of this particular webinar is going to be shared in a few days' time, roughly when actual SAT scores are going to return for most of our students. Tonight, we're going to be going through just a short history of the SAT over a really long period of time. We're going to do a much deeper dive into the current digital SAT and the adaptive engine behind it, best practices for studying for a test like this one, and how this newly evolved version of the SAT still sort of fits into the admissions process. Finally, at the end, we're going to leave time for Q&A. If at any point, again, you've got questions about anything, drop them in that Q&A and kind of chat feature as well, and we'll happily get to them at the end of tonight's talk. For reference, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and we'll try to leave at least 5 to 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. Now, you may be wondering why we would start with a history of the SAT when we're really supposed to be speaking to a version of the exam that only just debuted less than 2 weeks ago. There are two primary reasons to do so, one of which is tangential to the discussion, and then the other of which is really essential to understanding the current exam. The tangential component is that the College Board has existed for just north of a century. And the SAT is going to be celebrating, and I use that term loosely, its centennial in about a year and a half's time. Now, for context, that 100-year duration does help to speak to the College Board's kind of current survival, specifically at a moment in time when 85% of universities are test optional. For all of the reasonable and kind of valid criticisms of the College Board, it is a pretty adaptive organization. It evolves over time. It has somehow survived the aftermath of one world war, the entirety of a second world war, the Great Depression, the Great Recession, more recently a pandemic, which is to say, in all that time, it's become a billion-dollar behemoth, managing assets totaling $1 billion, and then separately generating about $1 billion a year in revenue from basically its testing and then data analytics services. It speaks effectively to how the College Board has maintained its presence in American life and maybe why it's not quite going the way of the dinosaurs, which we sort of thought would be the case at the start of the pandemic itself in 2020. More pertinently to today's tests and today's webinar, many of the question types that were featured on old SATs are now reappearing on the current SAT. So things that were sort of proudly retired sometime in the 2016 to 2023 stretch of the last SAT are now making a big comeback. That includes things like, but not limited to, the testing of vocabulary in fill-in-the-blank tasks, the analysis of poetry as part of reading comprehension, discrete grammar questions that sort of feature a single sentence or maybe two sentences where our job is to amend a particular piece of English in a specific context in which it appears. That is to say, when we or the College Board talk about the new digital SAT, we're also sort of speaking to a test that's actually a composite of really old component parts. Some of that is economically driven. If the College Board has now figured out a way to recycle its old materials from the last 30 to 50 years, it no longer has to invest nearly as much in actually generating and writing this new exam. We're going to get into why that's important in a little while, but the College Board has updated the SAT basically every 8 to 10 years for more or less the last half century. I first took the SAT myself as a freshman in high school in 1997, and you can now do the math on how old I am. And this particular new version of the SAT that just debuted is the fourth version of the SAT I'll have either taken or have taught in my lifetime. Most high school students wouldn't know that the test is full of old stuff, and I'd say it's not essential for them to know that either, but it does help to contextualize how the College Board has kind of arrived at this particular moment, producing the exam as it is. Now, the College Board has made two or three kind of primary claims as to why the SAT has gone digital. The first is to increase test security and reduce instances of cheating. Really worth noting, this is a somewhat curious claim because the College Board does regularly note how secure its testing procedures are worldwide. And if you followed the news of SAT administrations this past year, you've also probably heard that there's still some level of academic dishonesty going on, or at the very least, kind of sharing of test materials in ways that violate the College Board's user agreement. So the digitization of the SAT, to some minimal degree, might have addressed academic honesty concerns, but not in an overwhelming way. The second reason that the College Board claims that it updated the SAT is just to make it more accessible, which is really a twofold claim. First and foremost, the exam itself is shorter in total, and it features shorter questions. That does make it feel less intimidating, and at the very least, it sort of seems more inviting. Secondly, and this is sort of projecting into the future a little bit, we're in speculative land now, a test that's digital can theoretically be administered everywhere, and eventually it may be administered more frequently. Importantly, though, this means that the cost of producing the SAT has been reduced dramatically. An exam that has no physical form also bears no cost to the producer of the test, and in point of fact, all of those costs now actually shift to the test taker, who is going to provide or utilize their own device for testing. All of which is to say, the College Board's claims about why they've updated the SAT may sort of be true. The exam maybe does reflect something in the academic environment to a greater degree now than it might have last year. But in a broad context, there are a lot of other things that are also at work. Here, it's really worth noting that literally every major test has not only basically gone digital, but undergone similar changes to the ones that the SAT now features. The College Board announced its major overhaul of the SAT in late 2021, and to the organization's credit, it did stick to that timeline, launching the current digital SAT as projected in the spring of 2024 here in the US. In late 2023, the ACT also started to inch toward digitization with a note that students can now take a digital version of the ACT almost anywhere that they could also take the paper-based exam. To clarify, the ACT has stated fairly clearly that it has no plans on becoming a computer adaptive exam or overhauling the current test in a major way, but that may change sometime later this year. Separately, and just more broadly and more deeply, it's further worth noting that the GMAT, the GRE, and the LSAT have all been digital for quite some time, or basically have been since the start of the pandemic. All three of those tests have become shorter, they feature fewer questions, and in many ways, they've abandoned kind of their most intimidating component parts. They're still difficult tests. I wouldn't want to sell them short, but in each of these cases, what was at one time a 4.5 hour test basically now maxes out at about 3 hours. And notably, the exams still effectively cost the same to take. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. This is all to say that basically every testing organization, every producer of a standardized test is adopting changes to accommodate the fact that students can now opt out of these exams at any moment. If 85% of all undergraduate institutions are test optional, which is kind of astonishing in some, a staggering 98% of all graduate programs are test optional. So the GRE, for example, is in real danger as a kind of standing test in that particular way. The testing organization's only real choice as a survival strategy just seems to be to make these exams feel more accessible at the surface level. If every single one of these tests has been modified in a fairly similar fashion, we can attribute a lot of that to the exogenous event of the pandemic. The adoption of digital testing, seemingly universally, does make sense for reasons that have more to do with kind of economics and finance than almost anything else. The cost of producing shorter tests in a digital form drops dramatically, but every one of these tests cited here still costs the same as they did a year ago. The SAT of yesteryear cost $60 to register for. If you register by the normal deadline, it costs $60 now, but the exam is much shorter, has many, many fewer questions, and again, is going to be taken through a medium that the student provides, not the College Board itself. It does feel in a lot of ways like a lot is changing, especially kind of when framed in this massive way with a broad scope. But there is some good news in that a lot of things do really stay the same. For students who are just starting to think about testing just for the college application process, their starting point is really unchanged. That's probably the best news. A student should definitely take some time to decide if they want to pursue the digital version of the SAT or maybe the paper-based version of the ACT. And they want to ensure that it makes sense to test it all given their goals and their starting scores when puzzling that out. Moreover, definitely it makes sense to determine if it makes sense to test at all, which is something that the Collegewise team is actually great at helping to facilitate. Moreover, the content and scoring of the new digital SAT remains at least sort of familiar, even given the advent of some relatively newly stylized question types. The SAT is still going to provide a geometry formula sheet for reference, and students are still going to take these exams at a local high school, which is to say in relatively familiar environments across the board. Finally, and importantly, for students that have a 504 plan or an IEP in place in school, the students that have accommodations in school are going to receive them on these particular exams. And the College Board basically will ensure that, if not just for the SAT, then for the PSAT, all AP exams otherwise. What is new about the digital SAT all sounds pretty great, at least descriptively. It's a shorter, less intimidating version of the exam that allows for more time per question and then fewer overall questions than ever before. The current version of the SAT has only 98 questions, but the previous version of the SAT had anywhere, or previous versions, I should say, had anywhere from 150 to 250 problems. The exam itself now is a multi-stage computer adaptive test, which is what allows it to be a shorter test as a whole. And because it's digital, there's an inbuilt calculator for all students to use called Desmos. If you're a parent who has a student in Algebra 1 or Algebra 2 or pre-calculus or calculus, you may be familiar with Desmos, and it's very likely that your students are as well. But it's good to note, as part of the digital SAT, Desmos is just an inbuilt feature for the exam, and it's accessible for all portions of the math section. Finally, students are going to be able to test on their own device, which is to say, probably a Chromebook, a familiar laptop, or maybe a tablet if they want to use that particular type of device. The reason that that's important to note is that whereas previously students had rolled into a school, worked in kind of a clunky, mechanically heavy process using a physical booklet and then a physical bubble sheet as well, now at the very least, students will boot up a device that they actually can practice with on their own, such that on test day, the physical nature of the exam is going to feel surprisingly familiar. Digging into the format of the new digital SAT, we find again that descriptively, the test is a fairly friendly exam. It's basically divided into two sections. Section 1 is the reading and writing section, and then section 2 called the math section. Each section is itself divided into two modules. Module 1 and Module 2 for reading are going to feature 27 questions to be completed in 32 minutes under standard time. If a test taker has 50% extra time, that 32-minute span becomes a 48-minute span. If a student has double time, it would go from 32 minutes to 64 minutes per module for the reading. After that second reading module is complete, students will get a 10-minute break, during which time they can do basically whatever they want. Eat, drink, walk around, stretch, go to the bathroom, talk to friends. They can basically do anything except for talk about the SAT or access kind of their phone or other electronic devices. After the break's all done, they're going to return for the mathematics section. And the math modules are going to feature 22 questions for each module to be completed in 35 minutes, with a note that students working through each of these modules they must use, all of the time that's allocated, which is to say that they can't skip ahead if they finish something early. In total, the test is going to run for just shy of 2.5 hours, including that break in the middle. For reference, and just with sense to my own test day, I showed up at Travis High School at 7:45 in the morning. I was checked in and started the exam at 8:30. I was fully done the test by 11 a.m. All previous test takers under standard time would have taken a kind of a 3.5, 4 hour testing window. This particular test was over and done with effectively before lunch. And when we finished, we just closed our laptops or Chromebooks and basically just went on our merry way. For the modules themselves and just digging into the specific content of the exam, the reading modules are going to feature 4 primary question types, always arranged in the same fashion. Each reading module is going to begin with kind of text completion or fill in the blank questions, followed by discrete reading comprehension passages, followed thereafter by grammar questions, followed thereafter by what are called synthesis questions. Those synthesis questions, it's worth noting, are the only actual new question type featured on the whole SAT. They're not mined from seemingly some previous version of the exam that's existed up until now. And the way the synthesis questions are put together, a student will be presented with a series of bullet points, and they'll then quite literally be asked to synthesize or summarize those bullet points with a specific focus in mind. For the SAT itself, and within those particular reading modules, the questions are going to ascend in difficulty by type. So that first text completion question is going to be relatively easy. The last text completion question, which may be like question 4 or 5 within that module, is going to be relatively hard. And then the first reading comprehension question is going to reset and be relatively easy. And then the last reading comprehension question will reset and become, or I should say, will ascend in difficulty and become fairly tough. What is notable, there are going to be 54 total reading questions on the entire exam. That's fewer questions than there were previously on just the reading comprehension section on the last SAT. And those particular questions are going to be scaled in a scoring range from 200 to 800 points, where the average reading score is roughly a 500 to a 520 at any given time. For the mathematics module, kind of a similarly structured layout. The math modules are going to consist of 22 questions with a dominant focus on Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, a little bit of geometry, and then some data analysis as well. The math module questions fairly linearly run from relatively easy to relatively hard. which is to say that question number one might have been a question that a student could have answered in like the eighth grade or responded to in the eighth grade if they were taking kind of pre-algebra or algebra 1 that year. By the time they get to question number 22, they're still going to see a variation of algebra 2, just modified with respect to difficulty. Questions will become more abstract. They'll become kind of more littered with constants and variables rather than kind of standard numbers that are easy to work with or navigate. It's good to note those 44 total math questions from the 22 math questions on each of the two modules are also going to garner 200 to 800 points on that familiar SAT scale, with a note that the average math score is right around a 530 to a 540 at present. This is also to say, just in sum, SAT scores range from a 400 at the low to 1600 at the high. If you're old like I am old, you probably remember that kind of scoring range from way back when, but it's basically been this scoring range almost every year with the exception of a few short years from 2007, 2008 until 2015. For the composite average, if there's a minimum of 400, maximum of 1600, average SAT scores hover right around a 1050, 1060 for the time being. Now, the thing that's notable about the SAT and what does differentiate it quite a bit from previous versions of the exam is the adaptive engine that kind of drives the whole test. The reading section and the math section is each going to feature, again, two modules, the first of which for each subject is a kind of diagnostic section for a given test taker. Based on how a student does with module 1, that's going to affect the difficulty level and then potential scoring outcomes available from module 2. On both modules, it's certainly worth noting that harder questions are worth more points, easier questions are worth fewer points, and as a function of that, two different test takers can get the same total number of questions right, but also receive fairly different scores. That is to say, if I get 22 out of the 44 math problems right, if they're 22 relatively easy math questions, I'll probably land at somewhere around a 500, which is to say just below average. If I get 22 out of 44 math problems right, but they're somehow all hard math problems, my scores are going to be above the average, probably closer to a 550, 560, 570. Importantly, and this is worth noting from kind of common spoken to experience from all test takers this past round, it seems like the calibration of the SAT is still changing over time. That's not exactly unusual from a historical context, but it is strange for a given test taker on a recent test day. In point of fact, every time the College Board releases a new version of the SAT, the scoring calibrations for its exams change over the years that it exists. And moreover, the experience that a test taker has in March, maybe of 2024, is probably going to be pretty similar to the experience that a test taker would have in October, November, or December. But it's possible that next year's SAT is going to look and feel a little bit different with respect to its difficulty and the scoring outcomes that we can kind of project from that. It's good to note the broad strokes of the SAT as an adaptive test with an adaptive engine seem to be fairly fixed in place, with the caveat and the note that the SAT has kind of become a black box. Up until the digitization of the SAT, it was possible to really predict how well a student had done within an exam. It's not an easy thing to do. I wouldn't recommend that it's worthwhile to do so during a test day, but on older versions of the test, every question was worth the same point value. And if you had a goal of getting to a particular score, you could also speak pretty well to how many questions you needed to get right within a particular section to get that scoring outcome. On the current version of the SAT, that's much more difficult. One, because everybody's seeing a slightly modified version of the exam. And then two, individual questions are no longer worth the same point value. So one test taker, again, that gets 70% of questions right on a test may get a different score than somebody else who also got 70% of those questions right on the exam. And that's just a function of how difficult and how weighted those particular questions ultimately were. For our purposes, and this is really good to note, a student is going to work through module 1 of the reading section or the math section. We could again identify those or describe them as being kind of medium level difficulty, or we could say that they kind of contain a broad range of problems from relatively easy to relatively hard. That's kind of especially true on math module 1, where question number 1 within module 1 is going to be very simplistic, and then question number 22 within module 1 is going to be fairly tough. Depending on how a student fares with that first module, the second module is going to adapt upward or downward with respect to their performance. It seems that roughly getting 70% of the questions right on that first module does track into that second harder module, in which it adapts upward for both subjects. However, that's still qualified by the fact that those harder questions are worth more points, easier questions are worth fewer points. And so if a student misses a relatively easy problem early on, it may not impact their performance as much as getting a harder question wrong sometime later in the exam. In sum, and this is crucial, the exam does feel easier and it does seem easier in a kind of generic descriptive sense. It's a shorter test with fewer questions, and descriptively, it does sound a lot less intimidating. This is something that all of my students told me when they opted to take the digital SAT in March, and if they decided to take it again in May or June or August, and so on. But most importantly, for the majority of test takers, something like 65% of test takers are going to receive an easier version of the SAT. That's because they're going to struggle with Module 1 and they're going to track into the easier version of Module 2. And that's actually going to ensure that most people really do feel like the SAT is an easier exam. And it's debatable as to whether that's a good thing or not. So as a contextual note, a lot of my students chose to take the digital SAT in March because when they took the digital PSAT in October, the test felt that much easier. What they didn't recognize as a function of that was that if the test felt easier, it actually meant that they struggled with large parts of it. And when their scores came back, they weren't particularly fussed about the numbers. If a student felt like the PSAT was easy and they got an 1100 out of 1520 on the PSAT, it's good to note an 1100 is a pretty solid score. But most students saw that particular number and thought, man, well, this test felt pretty easy. I could probably crank that score up and improve it quite a bit with minimal effort. And the problem that they didn't recognize, and the thing that they couldn't recognize, no one who's never seen an adaptive exam would know this, if they did perform better, the test would then become much harder and it would push their performance back down toward the median and back down toward the mean. This is the real function of a computer adaptive exam. It has what's called a strong centralizing tendency. It doesn't want test takers all hovering at the bottom. It doesn't want test takers all hovering at the top. What it instead does is feed easier questions to test takers who may struggle with that first section to allow them to rise back toward the mean and even beat that mean. And then secondly, for students that see the harder second module or the harder second section of a multi-stage exam, those students are then going to be pushed back downward because they're going to see questions that are meaningfully more difficult and meaningfully harder to navigate. What I have been reminding students of pretty consistently, and especially at the start in the winter when they began studying for the SAT, is that the SAT is still the SAT. At base, it's a formidable exam, even if it doesn't feel that way. And it's notable that because the SAT is a standardized test, if it really is easier for everybody, in point of fact, it's actually easier for nobody. And that's because the percentile ranking that the SAT is kind of normed around is established relative to other test takers who have also taken that exam that year or within that cohort. So for an easy test, if I have the best test day of my life and I do super well, I get 90% of questions right, but everybody else alongside me also gets 90% of questions right, that would mean that that easy test just norms itself around 90%. So that kind of becomes like a C, so to speak. And that's a pretty extreme example, but if that were the case, that's why an easier exam doesn't actually benefit anybody, with the note that the SAT isn't actually easier, it just kind of feels that way here and there. Much more importantly, and this is really, really helpful to keep in mind, computer adaptive tests are more difficult to predict scoring outcomes for, and relatively strong test takers, especially. The exam is going to feel more difficult for stronger test takers, and in some ways unexpectedly more difficult over time. This is notable because even the College Board's own official practice materials really do seem easier than the material found on the real exam that's been administered, not just here in the US this past month, but also internationally, worldwide over this past year. Coming out of the March 9th SAT, Students who seemed to receive that upward adaptive module for reading and for mathematics noted that their exam felt much, much harder than the core content than they had anticipated or had necessarily prepared for. In a strange way, students are now forced to prepare for sort of two different versions of the SAT. First, there's that adaptive quality to the exam that we all sort of have to adjust to. It's worth keeping in mind. It's not worth stressing about within the exam, but it is worth knowing that it's happening. The second, though, is that this contending reality that the upper level of difficulty we might expect from the current SAT is actually higher than we'd initially be able to recognize. That means that it's worth working on fairly difficult material for high-scoring test takers, anybody basically who's aiming for above a 650 or beyond. This is to say, and this is notable, it's all the more important to practice like you're going to play. If you're prepping for the SAT, get familiar with the College Board's proprietary app, Blue Book. It's worth noting that the College Board has continued its relationship with Khan Academy to allow for kind of free material to prepare for the exam itself, especially if one is preparing for the exam relatively soon in May or June at this point. If one is preparing for the ACT, just by contrast, if any of this sounded so jarring that you're like, nope, I'm not dealing with the College Board, I'm going ACT, paper-based tests are great. There's a fairly comparable system for the ACT relative to the Khan Academy that's available if you purchase the official ACT guide just for reference. For anybody interested, especially if you just want to explore the College Board system in a pretty realistic fashion, the Blue Book app can be downloaded for any students who don't have it yet at bluebook.collegeboard.org, and it's worthwhile to get familiar with the interface for this particular exam. Notable thing, for anybody who's ever taken a College Board test, if you've taken the PSAT 8 or PSAT 9 as an 8th or 9th grader, the PSAT 10th or 11th grade, the SAT, and soon any AP exams, you might already have Blue Book installed on a school-issued device, just for reference. Beyond just updating the device and updating the app to make sure it's the most recent version, you may actually already have access to this without any extra or additional effort. If you do actually have it already, open up Blue Book just to see what it looks like and to get familiar with the application itself. Just to look at the way the test is put together and really to note some of these interface qualities, it's good to see that there's a timer at the top of the screen, really front and center for anybody who's taking the exam. There are annotation tools available for test takers who want to use them, and there's even a strike-through function that you can use to eliminate answers on screen. This is to say that the College Board did a reasonably good job, or at least they tried to do a reasonably good job, of showing how one can actually interact with an exam in a digital environment. One of the broad criticisms of digital testing, and I think digital reading just more generally, is that it really does force a kind of passivity on test takers or on users. Blue Book actually has enough interactive features that you really can kind of mark up the exam almost in a way that's similar to marking up a paper-based test. It is really good to note as well, the Blue Book app is fairly stable. It doesn't seem to crash. It doesn't really seem to lag on test days, which is really, really surprising. Kudos again to the College Board for pulling that off. And then finally, it's good to note that outside of technical issues for launching the PSAT way back in October, there were still reported tech problems for the March 9th digital SAT, but far fewer than one might have initially anticipated. Because the SAT is a digital test, it does become all the more important to become familiar with the technology available to you during test day, not just the app, but everything else too. It's worth getting used to the general qualities of Blue Book and kind of working within a digital testing environment, but it's also worth it to get used to the graphing calculator that's built into the exam, again, Desmos, and then the calculator that you yourself are permitted to bring to test day as well. This is to say that in spite of the fact that Desmos is built into the SAT and everybody now has access to a fabulously powerful graphing calculator, if you have a TI-84 at home and want to bring that to test day, you certainly should as well. Because of the nature of the exam and its adaptive engine, it becomes helpful to check your work on that first testing module in each individual section, again, the reading and the math, That really, I guess, has always been true. No one would have said at any point in history, like, oh, just blitz through that first section, you'll be fine, don't worry about it. But because Module 1 has a profound impact on what's going to be available to a test taker heading into Module 2 for both the reading and the math, it is really helpful to force oneself to go back and check every single problem just to make sure that there were no mechanical errors and just to make sure that there were no misread questions on the back end. For reference, and it is really, really good to note, that first module is going to determine either the floor or the ceiling of a test taker's performance, with a reminder again that those harder questions are going to be worth more points and they are going to be more challenging by extension. For some test takers, and this depends on a person's own strategy, it may mean prioritizing questions of certain types or learning to work at a pace that the exam may set for the test taker themselves. This is to say, within a section or within a module, test takers can definitely skip back and forth within that module. And if they wanted to do questions of a certain type or a certain difficulty level first, they may be advised to do so, or at least they may feel more comfortable doing so. I wouldn't suggest working on all the hard stuff first and then going backward through the exam, for example. But on the reading section, if you happen to really love grammar questions, but you're not such a fan of those vocabulary questions, you can skip all the way to the grammar questions, which are always found somewhere between questions like 15 and 23, 24, and just do those first and then come back to the vocab at the end if desirable. Finally, it's certainly worth noting that it's worth it to guess when a student needs to. At least at face value, there's no penalty for getting questions wrong on the current version of the SAT. And I say that with some qualification because within the exam, clearly, if we get a certain volume of questions wrong, the SAT does seem to cap our performance at some sort of indeterminate place. With respect to preparation, it's certainly worth building one's vocabulary around the SAT's kind of tested vocab list. In 2015, the still president of the College Board, David Coleman, loudly proclaimed that the SAT would be stepping away from kind of volume vocabulary memorization and just rote learning of random words. And at least for a brief spell, that was really true. But now it's worth checking in with your students and seeing if they know the definitions of random words like but not limited to buttress or innocuous or the adjectival form of the word novel. However random those words may seem, they all seem to appear on the College Board's official materials, which means there's some likelihood that those very words are going to show up on any given test day. And it's worth noting again for the vocabulary questions, those show up first on both reading modules. So we're hit at the outset with that particular kind of language testing. Most importantly, and again, with apologies for repeating myself, it is worth it to practice like you're going to play. Use the device that you're going to use on test day in practice and for practice exams. Get used to a kind of hybrid testing experience using both pencil and paper just to jot things down if it's helpful, and then some of those annotation features available to you within Blue Book. It's worth noting how the adaptive engine kind of functions, but don't focus on it too much during the test itself. It just becomes a huge distraction to try and puzzle out how hard questions are within the exam that you're currently taking. Every version of the SAT is going to feel at least a little bit difficult for everybody. Focus on the question at hand and put all of your mental energy into that task before moving on to the next one. To these ends, it does help to find the most effective instructor that's available to you, either locally or virtually. That probably was always true, but it comes with some notable caveats, at least for the time being. The recommendations on that front, again, are a little unusual, but there are a few ways to ensure that you'll find a tutor or a teacher who can really support you or your students' efforts. For now, and somewhat unusually, it does help to find an instructor that has worked with an international student cohort. That might sound a little odd, but the test, as it exists, the digital and adaptive SAT, debuted everywhere except in the US in March of 2023, which is to say quite literally a year ago. And this is to say that a student who's worked with an international student community has more familiarity teaching to this version of the SAT than anybody else who just started working with an American student population more recently. It's also helpful separately to find someone who has experience teaching to the digital SAT, the GRE, and even old SAT subject tests that don't really exist anymore. That's because a lot of the question types found on those older exams are currently popping up again on the current version of the SAT. Again, those fill in the blank tasks, just for reference, analysis of poetry and the reading comprehension, those sort of discrete vocabulary questions as well that kind of appear and populated older versions of the SAT and are now back on the current version of the exam. Finally, and probably most importantly, find someone who can speak to the specifics of computer adaptive testing. That's especially important in order to help students with stress, time management, prioritizing questions in rank order during their own exam experience. And for what it's still worth it to maybe find an instructor who has like an official SAT guide, that kind of big blue iconic book that's existed for so many years now. But make sure that they can assign work in a digital form, just to make sure that a student can practice on their device in the way that they would actually exam. Man, I know we covered a lot of ground, literally going back nearly a century at the start with reference to the SAT and the College Board. And it's worth noting that colleges and universities are now updating their test requirement policies, with some schools continuing to allow for students to submit tests only if desirable. That's the case, for example, at the University of Michigan, which continued, I think, fairly permanently its test optional admissions policy. And then some universities, by contrast, are sort of reverting to their old test required admissions policies. That's been the case at Yale, at Dartmouth, and more recently, and here locally in Austin, UT Austin. It's worth it, I think, to keep abreast of the news. And it's worth it, certainly, I think, to do as much research as you can, figure out how universities feel about these exams, whether they require them or not, and basically how they seem to be navigating this body of material, especially as it changes over time. However, it's worth it also to remember that even though testing in this kind of environment feels a little stressful, it's certainly novel, just to bring that particular word back. And it may even feel perfectly reasonable to actively pursue these exams themselves. It's worth it to remember that tests are never the most important thing. Every university that has announced newly established or reestablished testing requirements has also acknowledged that exams in the admissions process are helpful, but they're not the centerpiece of any application package. Focus on the bigger picture in planning for that journey ahead. And with that in mind, I'm going to kick things back to Danielle, who's going to help us conclude this part of the journey.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. That was fantastic. I know we have a lot of burning questions from the audience, so I won't keep us too long before we start answering those. But for those of you who might be unfamiliar with us, I know I gave a little intro on Collegewise in the beginning, but a little bit more about our work. We are here to help students like you and families like yours get to where you want to go. Best fit college, whether that's through our one-on-one counseling or our test prep and tutoring services. You can work with amazing tutors like Michael and the rest of our team to get you ready for the new digital SAT or decide which one to take or whatever that looks like. I know a lot of families out there might be wondering what the specifics of a program with us might look like and what we can really do to help. I will say from my personal experience, I decided to tackle the college admissions process on my own the first time around, and I ended up not getting admitted to nearly as many schools as I thought. It was a lot more difficult and overwhelming than I anticipated, and I ended up at a university that really was not a good fit for me. When I decided to transfer, I got support of a college counselor, and it was a game changer. I ended up at a university that I loved, and I wouldn't have been there without them. So if you're considering it in any way, shape, or form, I highly recommend having a conversation with us. In fact, if you do want that, I will launch a poll right now. And if you answer yes to this poll, you'll get a call from me and a couple of my colleagues tomorrow, just for a quick 10-minute chat, tell you a little bit more about us and start to figure out if we could be a good fit in your support system to help you guys get to where you need to go. So answer yes, please, to that poll if you want to call from us tomorrow. And without further ado, let's use the rest of our time here to answer some of your questions. We're going to do our best to get to all of them. But no guarantees. So if you want to work with us, then you can get some one-on-one answers. But until then, let's dig in. So one of the first questions we got was more on the logistical side of thing, Michael. When do you hear about the testing dates, and how do you plan around that? Can you talk a little bit to that?
A great question. Actually, a great place to start. With apologies for not having shared that earlier. The College Board typically releases its testing window basically a full calendar year in advance. So the 2024 to 2025 testing year, I think the relative dates are already out. Registration for any test beyond June of this year will open later on in the spring or early summer. But generally, if you want a good heuristic for remembering when these tests fall, the first SAT in the kind of academic calendar year is always the last Saturday of August. And then basically from there, every test date is the first Saturday of the month. So there's an SAT in October, November, and then December. So they kind of stack them through the fall semester for applying seniors. Those are all going to be the first Saturday of the month, those latter three. And then the next SAT is going to be in March, and then there's one in May, and there's one in June. The March SAT is the second Saturday of the month in all cases. I only know that here in Austin, it's the first weekend of South by Southwest and the first weekend of spring break. So every kid who takes the SAT in March here in Austin has one extra half day of school before they actually get to leave and head to Seaside in Florida, basically for their holiday. And then the SAT test dates in May and June have always been the first Saturday of that month. That was actually true even when I was applying to college way, way back in 2000, 2001. The reason functionally is because the SAT calendar has always been geared around the East Coast school calendar. Starts a little bit later in the year, ends a little bit later in the year. And it's worth noting the SAT test date in May is always right before the AP fortnight. So basically students who might take the SAT in May and take a bunch of APs are going to be in for a lot of testing in a very short period of time. And then the June SAT is always 1 month after that. That was a lot, but as a simple recap, August, and then October, November, December, those specific Saturdays, and then March, May, and June are kind of the major dates on the national calendar.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And kind of on that topic, for juniors applying to college, when is the last kind of deadline for them that they can take the SAT and use it for their college apps?
That's a fantastic question. So the last time students could functionally take the SAT does depend a little bit on their application windows. So for students who might be applying early decision or early action, where deadlines may fall like mid-October or maybe the 1st of November, the last time that they'd probably want to test with any degree of comfort would be that October SAT test date senior year. What's notable, most regular decision deadlines, and this is a very separate conversation as to whether we want to pursue those regular decision deadlines, but regular decision deadlines tend to fall somewhere in December, January, February, and even beyond for some universities. I remember this past year, I had a student applying to Auburn. She knew she needed a 1300 on the SAT, and Auburn's application deadline was well into the calendar year, I think in late December or early January. So she ended up taking the SAT her last time in December. It's in no way advisable to do that. It's in no way the norm, but in her particular case, it made sense to do so. Best practices, just generally for any given student, take the SAT maybe once during junior year, twice if desirable, and then maybe a third time and the last time sometime during senior year. And that's assuming that a student wants to pursue testing, wants to pursue that kind of study. To get back actually to the first question that you had raised, and something I should note too, most testing study timelines run for somewhere in the range of 6 to 10 weeks leading up to an exam. So students who might have taken the March 9th digital SAT just a couple of weekends ago, they probably started studying at the top of the year or at the very end of December just to use that window leading up to the March exam. And they might resume leading into May or June if they test again, basically later on this spring.
Awesome, thank you. We have a couple of questions about study materials. If previous study materials from the old SATs are still relevant, how far back can you go that it's relevant? Has Khan Academy prep kind of adjusted yet? And just if you could touch a little bit about SAT prep materials and what you recommend. We have a lot of
But
people asking about that.
oh man, those are fantastic questions. So two things for clarification. It seems like the College Board is very much mining its old exam materials and exam questions for its current test, but I wouldn't recommend that you kind of go back to find that SAT guide from 2005 to
Mhm.
study for the new version of the SAT. The questions really are stylized a little bit differently. They have a different number of answer choices, for example. And then moreover, on most old tests, especially old reading comprehension or SAT subject test in literature exams, most of the passages had like lots of questions affiliated with one passage. The current version of the SAT has discrete reading tasks. So it's just like one passage, usually about a paragraph long, and then one question. And that did feature on the old versions of the SAT from prior to 2015, but they're still adapted and updated in slightly pronounced and kind of effectively important ways. The challenge that the College Board always creates every time it updates its exams is that there's a real dearth of actual study materials when the test debuts. So currently in Blue Book, there's a practice PSAT. There are 4 practice SATs. They're adaptive. They really are digitally constructed. But that's basically it from the College Board in terms of the official practice exams. And then they have some separate materials. They have a couple of paper-based versions of the digital SAT, which is kind of interesting. And then they have a pretty large question bank. And the only issue with those additional materials is they actually all pull from the same question set. So if I work through practice test number 1 in Blue Book, I'll probably see questions that will appear on within these other materials if I'm looking for additional practice. That is to say that at least for the moment, it's worth it to kind of hunt around for quality materials when they can. The company that we partner with for some of our supplemental materials is called Test Innovators. They've actually done a pretty remarkable job of putting together not just practice exams that are pretty well calibrated, but also writing huge volumes of question banks sourced from the current materials that are available. There are still other organizations like ScoreSmart, and then basically big box companies, Kaplan, Princeton Review, that have spiraled, I think is the industry term, questions from the original source as well. It's a real question as to what the consistent quality of any given materials are produced by any third-party organization. But at least for the moment, it makes sense to hunt around and find what works, especially since the College Board's own materials seem to deviate a little bit from what the real exam looks and feels like at a certain testing level. I think that covered every base. That was
Yes,
a very long answer to a very good question.
that's okay. There was a lot in there, so thank you. We're getting a lot of questions about the SAT versus ACT, how to tell which one to take, should you take both, how the difference between the test, if you could touch on that a little bit.
That's, man, fantastic questions. So there are 2 things I would note that have remained kind of unchanged. And I spoke to this just a little bit early in tonight's webinar. It is certainly worth it to take a practice digital SAT, see how it looks and feels in real time, but most importantly, get some results back, see how the test actually shook out, and then take a practice ACT, see how the test looks and feels in real time, and then see how that exam shakes out. And the 2 things that I think I found, at least for my own students, this was, basically this past fall and now this spring, most of my students and most students, I think everywhere, do pretty comparably on both exams. They test a lot of the same skills. They ask you to do a lot of the same things. They do have some overlap in their mathematics requirements, for example. But almost uniformly, if students kind of performed evenly on both tests, they basically opted into the digital SAT. And almost all of my students said, well, the digital SAT just feels easier. It feels more accessible. It's less intimidating. When I finish the exam, I don't feel exhausted. And the only problem with that is it's very easy to be guided by the feeling of an exam. It literally feels easier. Why wouldn't you run with it? But I think the ACT actually allows for easier improvement, basically because it's a predictable exam. The caveat to that is the ACT, it is much longer. It's still about 3.5 hours in full. and it's a much faster test. So the advantage to the ACT is that its questions are very simplistic, they're very black and white, but you basically run an academic sprint the entire time from start to finish. And a lot of students, when they feel that pressure to finish 75 grammar questions in 45 minutes, worth noting, there are more grammar questions alone on the ACT than reading and grammar questions on the SAT in its entirety. When they see that volume of work that they have to do in such a short period of time, their immediate feeling is, oh my God, I can't believe I have to do this. And that's the first section of the exam in a 4-section test. Um, to my mind, I would say run with the test that feels easier, but also run with the exam where it feels like you can increase performance. And I think that's a bit of an unknowable question at the moment with the digital SAT. To my mind, the ACT hasn't changed. It's not going to change this coming year. So if students do equally well on both tests, I'd gravitate toward the ACT, even though it doesn't feel like a great thing to do.
Okay, thank you. We're getting some questions about clarifying the modules. If the questions in module 1 will be the same for every student, or is it different? Is it better to get the second harder module? Will colleges know the differences and get like the different scores was another good question. So if you could dive into that a little bit more.
Oh my God, those are such great questions. You're an impressive audience. I know I'm speaking just generally, but those are fantastic questions. So, to answer the first question first, what is interesting about the SAT, the paper-based version of the exam, basically through December 2023 here in the US, everybody saw the same first reading section. Everybody then saw the same grammar section, and then the math section is the same as well. And what's really interesting on the digital SAT, effectively module 1 was mostly the same for everybody. And the one exception was that, like in the math module 1, the numbers were different in different problems. So if my question number 1 hypothetically described like Bobby's salary was $35,000 a year, the person sitting next to me, their module 1 might have had a problem that actually says Susie's annual salary was $42,000 a year. And the question from there would basically be the same, but the numbers would be different. The answers would be different as well. And that speaks to the College Board's claim that they wanted to make a more secure test. I can't just look over at the test taker's screen next to me and think, oh man, they clicked A. I'm clicking A for that first question, because my first question may not have that particular answer. So in small ways, the tests modules actually are different in granular ways across the board. What's really notable is that when test takers shift into module 2, about a third of the population will see a much harder module 2, and then about 2/3 of the population will see a much easier module 2. And this is, I think, going to get to the second and the third questions a little bit. Universities themselves wouldn't really have any idea if a student saw a harder or an easier module 2, except at the extreme ends of the scoring scale. So if I have a 700 on the math section, for example, I must have seen the harder math module, the harder adapted second math module. If I have a 300 or a 400 on the math section, I definitely saw the easier math module. The weird fuzzy part is right in the middle. And so when students take the SAT, if they do see the easier second module, they're not forced to the bottom of the scoring scale. If they get everything right, if they basically run the table on the second easier math module, their scores will max out in the upper kind of 500 range, somewhere around a 560, 570, 580. It's tough to do that. It requires like real attention to get every question right in a section, but it's not impossible. And then similarly, if a student does really well on module 1, but then just gets absolutely crushed by module 2 because it's much, much harder, their scores will probably come in at around that same floor, somewhere around a 560, 570, 580. And what's notable, the second test taker, or I should say the first test taker, the one that saw the easier math module, they'll have gotten many more questions right, but the juice that came from those questions is going to be a little bit more limited. Universities, though, would have no way of really knowing unless they were really looking at these score reports in some very deep way. And typically they just don't. They look at headline numbers, They want to see if thresholds are met, or if a score would be helpful to understanding an application. And if the scores aren't, they just kind of put them aside. That's pretty much it.
Okay.
I think that answered the second and the third parts, if memory
Yes.
serves.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We are about to reach time. So before I do that and answer one of our last questions, if you haven't gotten your questions answered and you think you might want to work with us, just answer yes, please, to this poll, and we will give you a quick call tomorrow, just to check in and give you a little bit more info. But I'll leave that running and I'll jump to our last question, which hopefully will be a quick one. But because the testing is digital, will scores be given to students quicker?
That's actually a fantastic question. At least as of now, no. So the
Oh,
paper-based SAT for the last 5 years, it's been a 13-day turnaround time, which is not bad. When I was in high school, 2 months. It was a lot of waiting. But now, no matter when you take the SAT, you'll always get your scores back in time before the next SAT. So if I take the exam on May 4th this year, I'll get my scores back 13 days later. It's always on a Friday. And then I can basically prep a little bit for the June exam if I wanted to do so a couple of weeks after that. Eventually, I think when the College Board fully and finally norms its tests and calibrates them in the way it wants to, at some point you'll actually get scores immediately. And if you are a person who's ever taken the GRE or the GMAT, you know what that experience is like of taking a version of a computer adaptive test, and the minute you finish, you get your scoring outcomes. So I took the GRE most recently, just a couple of months ago, and actually about a month ago in February. The minute I finished the exam, my scores were present, and I could send them off to universities of my choosing that day if I wanted to. At least for now, though, on the SAT, 13-day turnaround time. For reference, somehow, in spite of the fact that the ACT is a paper-based test, the ACT has the College Board beat at a 10-day turnaround time. So there's one advantage to the ACT. You do get your scores back just a few days sooner.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you all for joining us. You will be receiving the recording tomorrow afternoon, so keep an eye out for that. And we have tons of webinars every week, so hopefully we'll see you again soon. Until then, have a good night. Thank you, everybody.